The Holy Gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ according to Matthew. Glory to you, Lord. When Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said to him, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but God in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. So this morning we find Jesus on what I call the Reign of God tour across the Holy Land. He has been visiting all of these cities and places, healing people, telling them about God's love, restoring their dignity, raising the dead, proclaiming God's reign in their midst, and reminding people that God ultimately loves them. And he goes around, especially to these pagan cities now, proclaiming this message. And as with any good thing, when something happens in our lives, we tend to go share it with others. So people have been talking about Jesus. It happened then, and I think it happens now. If you find a really good restaurant or a really nice bottle of wine, we'll stick with the restaurant, you go and you tell half of your friends, and the next thing you know, all of your friends are off at this restaurant. Well, the same thing had happened to Jesus. Jesus had cured these people, and they are running around telling everybody that this great prophet has arisen. And so Jesus asked his disciples, "What are people saying about me? Who are they saying that I am?" And I can almost imagine Matthew, the tax collector, the numbers guy, coming up to Jesus and saying to him, "Well, you know, Jesus, I took a poll. And here's what the poll results say. You are trending in the positive. 90% of the people think that you are John the Baptist reborn, so that's a good thing. About 60% of them think that you are the prophet Elijah. Elijah was a good hero for Israel, so you are doing really good. And then another 30% or so think that you are kind of like that prophet Jeremiah. He was a little bit on the austere side, so that's not that great. But hey, you are trending. Your Twitter handle is blowing up. You are trending everywhere on social media. Everybody knows something about you, Jesus." And you can almost see Jesus look at them and saying, "Well, thank you very much for that information. Let's move on." But then he asks the question. It's easy to answer, what are people saying about Jesus? It's a little bit harder to answer, who do you say that I am? He asks the ultimate question. Who do you say that I am? And of course, you know, Peter is the first one to jump in. Peter is like that kid in the class that's always hands up. Ooh, me, pick me, please. And 90% of the time, Peter gets it wrong. I mean, really wrong. But this time, he gets it right. He says, "You are the Son of the living God, the Messiah." And Jesus commends Peter. You could almost feel Peter floating away, because Peter does not get commended too often. Usually, Peter gets something like, "Get behind me, Satan." Today, he gets, "You are going to be the rock on which I build my church." But the question, who do you say that I am, still remains. The thing is, how we today in our time answer that question will say more about who we are than what it will say about who Jesus is. We are challenged with answering the question, if you were stranded on a desert island and someone on that island had never heard of Christianity, never heard of Jesus, and asked you what you believed in and who you followed, how would you tell them who Jesus is? Something for you to ponder this week. But it is this wonderful story to me that sheds a little light on who Jesus really is. There's a story of a rabbi walking down the street with a bunch of his students. And he says to the students, "How do you know when it's the beginning of a new day?" And the first student gets up and says, "Well, you know it's a new day when there's enough light outside that you can tell a pear from an apple." And the rabbi says, "Well, great, wonderful, but not quite the right answer." Then another student gets up and says, "Well, you know that it's a new day when there's enough light that you can look down the road and you can tell the difference between a fox and a dog." And the rabbi goes, "Well, very creative and wonderful, but not quite the right answer." The rabbi says to them, "You know that it is a new day when you have enough light to see God reflected in your sister's and brother's face. And until then, it is still night. Until you can see God reflected in the faces of your sisters and brothers, it is still night." I think that rabbi a couple hundred years ago got it right, and I think that his words are true for us today. How and who we see Jesus in our lives today really matters. So who do you say Jesus is? I say Jesus is that teacher that goes out of her way to make sure that that student that is struggling at home and in the class has the extra time and resources to graduate and get through school. I say Jesus is the people who bring in these bags to feed people that we'll never ever meet, but whose little act of kindness makes a world of difference. I say Jesus is the camp counselor a couple weeks ago here at St. Paul's, who, when one of our 6-year-olds had a meltdown because a piece of her art disappeared, took the time to take her into another room and remake the art so that she can feel comforted and safe like all the other kids. You see, we tend to look for Jesus in all these big, glorious things. But Jesus is often in the ordinary, in those random acts of love and compassion that we do each and every single day that points more closely to who Jesus says, or who we say Jesus is. I am convinced that Jesus is not in all these places of giant power standing on the side of those who would oppress others. Yes, they need God's comfort and compassion as well. But it will say something about who Jesus is by how you are. Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of India spiritually and politically for a while, had a very interesting connection with Christians. He always said he loves Jesus. It's Christians that I can't stand. If these Christians were more like Jesus, I would be a Christian. The thing is, you and I, more often than not, are the only gospel that some people will ever read. And I think that's worth repeating. You and I are sometimes the only gospel, the only Jesus that somebody will encounter, period. How we interact, how we are, how we show compassion and respect dignity of every human being will say a lot not only about who we are, but about the Jesus that we follow. You and I are called to be Jesus in the world. And how we interact with those who are the least and the lowest, the pushed to the side, and the marginalized will speak volumes about who Jesus is. Because in the end, in this world, in this time, and in this place, the Jesus in the world is you. Amen.